Good evening. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it was perfect for what I'm going to talk about. It was a great prelude. I'm from the state of Florida, where the subject of evolution can be a bit touchy. This talk and other things. This talk this evening is unabashedly evolutionary, and I don't think it will shock anyone in an audience such as this. I hope not. So we'll begin at the beginning with what paleoanthropologists agree on, which is that we share a common ancestor with living chimpanzees, up here on the left, and it goes back to between 5 and 7 million years ago. I use 6.5 as the estimate for the divergence. The evidence for this is abundant. There's comparative DNA and other genetic evidence, and there's a fossil record, as you can see. So we go back to 6.5, and that's no reason why anybody in this audience or anybody else should be embarrassed. There we go. And the thing, as Diana said, that makes a hominid is walking on two legs. It's a bipedal gait, and that's more or less accepted as the primary thing that happened at that division. And as you can see in this slide, chimpanzees and other apes are capable, perfectly capable of getting up and walking on two legs. They just don't do it all the time, and they don't do it in the same way that we do. We're built differently. The entire body has changed over many millions of years in association with refinement of walking on two legs. And so while this chimp will kind of go along like this, the humans have nice, flowing, striding bipedal gaits. And I'm going to show you an animation, we hope, that I'd like you to look at. Here we have a ape, and we're going to make it bipedal, we think. And, okay, there we go. Bipedalism affects the entire body. You can see signs of it in modern human skeletons from the tip of the big toe on up to the base of the skull. But it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't affect the whole body simultaneously. The feet went first. And I think that's very, very important. I usually, for several decades now, have been concentrating on this end of the body, the brain case and what's in the brain case. But now I've moved to the other end of the body, and I'm really thinking about feet and bipedalism. And I'm going to give you a big picture slide here of the last 3.5 million years. On the left, you have a little hominid infant of Australopithecus afarensis. This is the species that Lucy belonged to. And we'll come forward to the right through time, and there's Albert Einstein over the right side. And I'm going to show you what happened to brain size over this duration of 3.5 million years. Watch the bouncing balls. That's brain size getting bigger during the last several million years. And you can see that it's associated with signs of material culture. This is the Stone Age. Okay, 3.5 million years. I have it a little older than it's often said to be, because it's, from my point of view, when you have the first signs of deliberately made stone tools. And we've got some fairly convincing evidence at 3.4 million, so we'll just go back. And you can see through time that those tools become more and more refined, and eventually we get other material inventions, including we've got the Atomic Age to the right. It's often said that association does not prove cause, and that's true. But also, just because things are associated, such as brain size and material culture, does not mean that they aren't causally linked, and I think in this case they are. So this is the Botanic Age. This is the Stone Age, and it's more or less received wisdom, this picture you're looking at. And what's been focused on in terms of thinking of cognitive evolution are stone tools. This is pretty traditional. And the tools particularly Would love to get a pointer, but it's not going to happen. The tools right here, these are Acheulean hand axes about 2.5 million years ago. Some cognitive archaeologists say, aha, this was a cognitive leap. This is when we had the big jump in hominid cognition, in brain evolution. And what's been implicit in this focus on stone tools is the notion that, well, who's making the stone tools? Males. And now it's not said out loud so much, but it's still there and it's still in the textbooks. Now, it's understandable that anthropologists would focus on stone tools because we've got them. Right? They don't perish. But there is, to the left of this is at 3.5, is the oldest age you see on the left. But recall from the first slide, we'd go back another 3 million years to 6.5, and that would be the origin of hominids, the time of the separation with chimpanzees. That's a lot of time, 3 million years. And so what I want to know is, what was going on then? This stuff didn't just jump out of the blue and start evolving the material culture and the hominids. Something had to have preceded it, and that's a long time for something to be going on. And so I call that the Botanic Age for reasons you will see. And we'll begin, again, back at 3.5. On the left, what you have is a picture of a chimpanzee in a tree nest, an arboreal sleeping nest. The great apes, all three of them, orangs, gorillas, and chimps, every day at the end of the afternoon, climb up into trees individually, although mothers with their attached nursing infants will climb up with the infant in tow, and they make themselves a big nest to sleep in. And they do it by pulling down vines and branches and weaving them. These are marvelous constructions. There is evidence that suggests that these great apes intuitively understand that they need the support underneath them when they're asleep, or they will go splat. This is something monkeys do not do. There are hundreds of species of monkeys. They don't build sleeping nests at night. Great apes invented it. And this may have been the first, stationary tool that they themselves invented. We all know of chimps using termite fishing rods, that kind of thing. But monkeys, you can always find examples of those sorts of things in monkeys. Also, a lot of use of sticks for feeding and that kind of thing. But these sleeping nests were a true invention, and they were a really, really important one. And I place that at the bottom of the Botanic Age. On the right here, you have a picture of Kat Coops, Professor Kat Coops, and she is an expert in cognitive evolution and in particularly in sleeping nests. And she has studied sleeping nests that are on the ground. Most apes make their nests in trees, but you'll find a few individuals will sometimes make a sleeping nest on the ground. And coming forward in time, eventually sleeping nests transitioned, all of them to the ground. And that has pretty significant implications for understanding hominid evolution, as Coops has pointed out. So let's get a picture, a big picture of the Botanic Age next to the Stone Age. On the left, you've got Botanic Age from 6.5 to 3.5, where you finally pick up your first signs of deliberately made stones. And then you come forward to a mere 5,000 years ago, and it's all Stone Age. In the Botanic Age, we have baskets in the trees, and they are like big baskets, and they're woven. With the shift to becoming terrestrial, this, I think, was long and slow, didn't happen overnight. But with the shift to terrestrialism, I think hominids invented one of their first deliberate botanical inventions. Other people have suggested this before me, like Adrian Zillman. And it is a little sleeping nest that keeps its contents from going splat. That's been woven and attached to the mother's body. females and all of these hominids would have understood completely how to weave containers to sleep in and to prevent themselves being hurt. So I think it was already there. It was already a natural thing to do. And in a while, I'll talk about why it was absolutely necessary. So I think we had baskets in the trees, going to baskets on the hip, and eventually to baskets on the ground. So we have botanic inventions. And weaving is really, really important. The whole weaving visually and in other ways. Textiles, but of course there's not a good record of perishable textiles or woven things or botanical digging sticks or any other kind of wooden tools. They perish, stones do not. So how do we get at the question of weaving, and are there any signs, anything we can look at to ask how old it might be? Helen Anderson, who's at the British Museum, studies this question, and she has, I think, a brilliant idea of looking at, you don't have the textiles themselves fossilized, but she looks at the designs, the crosshatched or zigzagging designs on artifacts that look very much like weaving. And she argues that in many cases they are intended to represent weaving. And furthermore, there's a shell here on the right where you have this cross-hatching and you have other fragments with cross-hatching. On the right, the age is 77,000 years old. And what she suggests is, she gets into cognition, is that somehow this is very much tied to the hominid's environment, and it was part of their nervous system. And I think that I've explored that. Her work was seminal, and so I began to investigate it further, and I think she absolutely has hit on something very important. Our nervous systems, if you look at the visual systems, the way we see and interpret things is the light comes into your eyes of whatever it is you're looking at. It eventually makes it to the first stop in the cerebral cortex at the back of the brain, where neurons, individual neurons, begin to assemble the image you're seeing, and they push the signals forward in the brain, and it gets added onto. But the first thing that happens is individual neurons, they each do one job. It might be neurons that are specialized for seeing just a line at a 30-degree angle, or another for seeing movement. And these are fundamentally, the shapes they see are fundamentally geometric. So I do think that she's right about the fundamental nature of geometric designs in the nervous system. There's something called the geometric enigma, which that can apply to, which is the fact that if you look at art around the world, the fossil record of art, the very earliest art, they're always geometric designs, not representational. You don't get to that till later, and I think her work fits in well with that. And if you want to do an Evo-Devo perspective and look at the development of art in children, initially what they'll do is, once they can finally hold the crayon, scribble, and as they mature more and their visual systems mature more, they'll start to do like a line or a cross or zigzags. And later they get to my favorite kiddie art, which is they'll make people by taking that circle and putting some sticks on it for arms and legs. So it all fits together with this notion of weaving being fundamental in our nervous systems and tied to the environment. There's other work which I shouldn't take the time to go into, but that shows that what you're exposed to visually as a developing infant programs the kinds of geometric things that you see. All right, so I want to just take a minute to talk about the botanic record, and it stretches into the Stone Age. So I think you had in the first 3 million years loads of inventions that were botanical. Once you start picking up rocks, modified stones, they don't stop. Botanical things continue to be invented, and it's an add-on thing. And so here are the oldest dates I can find for botanic wood and other botanical artifacts or signs of them in the record. The oldest is said to be 780,000-year-old polished plank from Israel. I don't have a picture of that. And then as you come forward to the right, you get to the 500,000 mark. At 500,000 years ago, there's a mussel shell, a seashell, from Java. It's a Homo erectus site, and it has zigzag geometric marks on it, which is interesting. And there's other evidence in Africa of these geometric designs at that same 500,000 year mark. At 476, this was in the news last week, there are in Zambia deliberately notched 2 logs. No one's quite sure what they were doing. Might have been the basis of some structure. And then as you go to the right, other well-known artifacts, the oldest spear in England at 400,000, and the oldest really beautiful throwing spears in Germany at 300,000. And then as you come forward, they won't even fit. They're so recent, I can't scale them on this. But you have at 77,000 this ochre thing which Anderson had pointed out with the zigzags. And then below it, you have the first sign of baby carriers at 15,000, which is an engraving. You can't see it here. It's art. It's an engraving. A dugout canoe, the first wood axle and wheel, and then at 2,000 years ago, a really important botanical invention in China, paper. And that was revolutionary because then we had memories that could be passed on. So this is just a little glimpse to show that the Botanic Age has its tendrils clear up until now. So what I'm going to do now is I want to switch to the issues of the evolution of cognition and mothers and babies that Diana mentioned. And I'm going to start in a really odd way, assuming I can make it go, which is we're going to look at a very famous cockatoo bird named Snowball. Does anyone know who this is? Because you're in for a treat. All right. So Snowball can do something that everybody in this room can do. The bird can keep a beat to regular rhythm that's sustained. It's called entraining motor, moving to sounds. Entrainment, being able to keep a beat. And this is crucial for music, obviously, and for musical arts, but also being able to keep a beat is very, very important in a fundamental way for language. And there's a literature that speaks to this, but when we have conversations, and they can be conversations between adults, or we could be talking about motherese, where you have a baby and a mother interacting, there's a rhythm, and you have reciprocity and interactions, and the individuals need to be able to keep the beat to anticipate what's coming next in their own speech or whatever stream, and in receiving it. So keeping a beat is important in terms of, as it says here, it has the elements for, with the expectations and the rules that listeners and producers have in order to hear and decipher and make fast, rapid speech streams. So this entrainment is fundamental, and this is why I'm now thinking more about feet and less about brains per se, because I think feet in the evolution of feet were very, very important in kind of an interesting way for the emergence of the ability to keep a beat. And I learned of this from a colleague in the literature who I actually wrote to because I had some questions, Mats Larsson, and he wrote a fabulous paper, co-authored it, talking about earliest homin evolution and some of the things that he envisioned happened to the fetus. He and I have since collaborated. We've put my earlier work on motherese and language together with his work, which I'm about to tell you about. And we have something that will be out. I fear it might not be until 2025, but it's a forum article in Current Anthropology. And right now it's out there being circulated to people in other countries that will comment on it. They'll rip it apart, and then Current Anthropology will send it back to us, and we'll get to respond. But I was very impressed with his work, and I'm trying tonight to highlight the fabulous seminal work of various people, and his is among it. This is his image, and what you see here is a pregnant or gestating hominid woman and her fetus. And in his article that blew me away, he hypothesized that fetuses in bipedally striding hominids were subjected to new kinds of sensations for the first time that quadrupedal or non-bipedal primates would not have experienced, because walking is relatively regular and it has a rhythm to it. You can go fast, you can go slow, but it's whatever pace you go at. Often you're walking at a sustained pace with a sustained beat. And what he suggested was that fetuses of females who are becoming bipedal, this is a process, that they hear the maternal foot beats through the amniotic fluid, and there's no doubt but that fetuses do hear, and they hear a lot. And not only do they hear it, they're sloshing around in time to it. They feel it. And that this sets up evolution of neurological substrates for synthesizing what's heard with what's felt. And that this is where what seeded the eventual evolution of entrainment. Okay, so so one thing we would ask is, well, why not in these quadrupedal apes? And it's because they're quadrupedal. They are perfectly capable of getting up and walking. They have all kinds of ways to move in their repertoire. As you see here, these are chimpanzees. And a lot of time is spent in the trees, same with the other apes, where they're clambering and they're going vertically and laterally or in various postures on the ground. It's four-handed, if you will, more or less, except for those times when they choose to stand up. It does not have a sustained rhythm to it. So Larson suggested this was where the ability to entrain, how it was seeded. He sees it as having been seeded with the beginnings and the continuation of the evolution of bipedalism, and further, that it doesn't stop there. Once infants are born in many parts of the world, even here, they can spend a lot of time being carried in baby slings, and they're getting the same kinds of experiences, hearing and feeling their mothers walking, and that this adds to the continuing development of the ability to keep a beat, which babies don't completely do until they're about 2 years old, when they're getting grammar and language. So not only did bipedalism affect what babies heard and their developing nervous systems, their mother's feet were becoming bipedal, and their feet were becoming bipedal. You're looking at a chimpanzee whose foot is not the foot of a habitual biped, because the big toes are out like this. But with the evolution and refinement of bipedalism, the big toes lined up the way yours are lined up, like this. And this had a devastating serendipitous effect on infants. At the same time, the neurological reorganization for keeping a beat is going on, because they lost or they failed to develop an ability that all monkey, there are hundreds of species, all monkey infants and all the great ape infants develop shortly after birth, which is the ability to cling with all fours to their mums, including with their feet. When the feet had big toes like this, no problem hanging on, and you see these non-human primates, these babies are hanging on fine. But once the foot became a bipedal foot, that ability was lost. We know for sure this happened during evolution because our babies can't do this, and all the others can. So babies couldn't stay glommed on to their mothers as their evolutionary predecessors had done. And this sort of gets me to an idea I had about 20 years ago, which I called the putting the baby down hypothesis. And it went like this, which was, I was looking at, this was, I now know I should not have done this, but I was looking at fully bipedal, thinking about fully bipedal hominids, and looking at about 1.6 million years ago, about the time of Homo erectus. And the putting the baby down hypothesis was that when mothers went out and made their living the way it's believed hominids did, which is the way chimpanzees do, which is to get up in the morning, say hi to everyone, crawl out of the tree, say hi to everyone, and then break up into little groups and go foraging, that if their babies could no longer hang on to the mothers, then the mothers had a problem, which is, how do they do what they have to do if part of what they have to do is carry a baby in their arms. And so I thought, well, they'd stop to dig for tubers or pick berries or just rest. They'd put their babies down. Primates in general, including human primates, don't like to be put down. They prefer to be picked up and carried. I think that's really ingrained. And they can signal their displeasure by crying and gesturing, other kinds of gestures. And I think it was at this point in evolution, not the 1.6, but at the point where babies were no longer able to remain attached to their mothers, that other kinds of ways of keeping in touch evolved, and these would be soothing kinds of cooing noises, very musical. And we do this today. It's called motherese or parentese or musical speech or infant-directed speech. It is, above all else, musical. You all know what it's like. You've probably all done it. It's repetitive. It's expressive of love and bonding. As infants mature, it becomes instructive, like, no, don't go there. If you see the baby crawling towards the light socket. And at an unconscious level, what adults are doing when they address infants is they are giving cues about language and what the infants need to know in order to acquire their languages. And so it's very repetitive and slow, and there are exaggerated pitch contours. It helps the infant learn where one word stops and the other begins, and it's pleasing to them. There's now a substantial literature which shows that it bootstraps language acquisition. And there's all kinds of evidence to do with the more it's good, the more you speak motherese to your developing infant, the better their language acquisition will be. Okay, so this is 20 years ago, and recently, somebody named David Lindsay, who's an interesting person, a musician and a writer, among other things, wrote an article which was a critique of the putting the baby down hypothesis, but in a nice way. And what he suggested was that if hominid infants, were losing the ability to stay attached, that it would have been a very, very long process in deep time, and that it would have been dangerous. There would have been severe natural selection. And so what he looked at, which was really fun, was he looked at modern babies and ape babies in an evo-devo, evolutionary developmental approach, and started looking at what little infants do, and they have certain reflexes come in and out of their development after they're born. And he looked at a sigh startle response, for instance, and he tied all of these into the hypothesis of infants falling off, hominid infants falling off their mothers because they couldn't hang on anymore, and how the infant would react. And it's an exact sequence that, in fact, you can elicit when you elicit this response in infants. And he said, okay, for instance, this is the one I really like this analogy that he did. Here you have a chimp on the right carrying an infant, and you can see the infant is hanging on with all fours. Should that, okay, now on the left what you have is hanging glider landing. And what Lindsay suggested was that when you do a hang glider landing, and I watched these on the video just to see if he was making it up, and he wasn't, is you kind of run with it forward the way you're going. And what he suggested is if you have a chimp mommy traveling that way and her infant is attached ventrally this way, the infant's head's going the way the mom's going, and if its feet loses a grip with the feet, it's going to do a back pedal hangward gliding landing. There was a polio epidemic among Jane Goodall's chimps, the chimps that she studied at Gombe. And there's a very interesting anecdote, but a true anecdote, of a mother, Madam B, who was a great mother, had multiple offspring, and then she was stricken with polio, and she lost the use of an arm. And this had a devastating effect on her infants because they kept falling off, and she couldn't do anything to retrieve them. And eventually they died, and they were just totally, they died from sustained falling. So this is a quotation from that, which illustrates the kind of severe natural selection one would envision from early on in the Botanic Age, when you have the initial ongoing selection for bipedalism. And here we have, so that hypothesis, the putting the baby down hypothesis, needs modifying in light of Lindsay's, I think, really perceptive suggestions that you know, it's way too recent. We really need to think about bipedalism, the origins of bipedalism, and how long and drawn out it would have been. And so I now think that, and have worked with Larson to combine this idea with his idea about fetuses and mothers, gestating mothers, and to put them together into a theory. And one of the things that would have happened is the feet would have been changing. And if necessity is the mother of invention, well then, baby slings would have been a logical thing to invent. So I see baby slings, the invention of baby slings. In the Botanic Age, these would be woven botanical materials, not the textiles you're looking at, and leather in baby slings of contemporary mothers around the world today. And on the left here, you have, I think, a gorgeous vintage photograph from the 1900s that was produced or taken by a missionary. It's an infant in New Guinea, and it's actually an air conditioner. The infant's suspended in very hot weather to kind of keep it in the breeze. And so the initial textiles and comparative studies of baby slings around the world support this. The initial baby slings would have been nets and woven kinds of fibrous materials, unlike the textiles we have today. This is a photograph of Professor Kara Walsh-Schleffler, who's in Seattle, who does physiological studies of women and women's carrying loads, and has demonstrated that women around the world are rather beasts of burden, in a sense. They're really built physiologically to carry loads, and you see that if you travel. You'll see women carrying incredible loads on their heads, on their shoulders. And the initial load, extra load to carry, of course, were gestating infants. And Walsh-Lesser says that she thinks baby slings were probably the first invention of hominids. So if you look at Larson's work and the putting the baby down hypothesis and put those together, there seems to be a triple whammy of bipedal feet. The first is that the females are walking regularly, and that's affecting the fetuses and their hearing the rhythm. And so they're becoming bipedal, the females, but their babies are falling off of them. The infants, meanwhile, because feet are becoming bipedal, are losing their ability to grasp. And you see here a grasping foot on the right of a chimp and a human foot on the left. So the babies are, maybe they're getting a sense of rhythm, but they're also falling off. And I think undergoing really a bottleneck, severe natural selection. So we put these things together, and this is one of the few, if not the only image in our paper, where we see really, really early in hominid evolution, we see selection acting on fetuses and on infants' feet, everybody's feet, but infants' feet in the way that I've described. And we see the ability to keep a beat being seeded then. We're not saying, you have music, you have language that early. We are not saying that. What we're saying is, here's this ingredient that's super important for music and language, and this is how we envision it might have evolved, putting these things together. And so you had this ability to entrain as a precursor skill or behavior to things that would have evolved more recently, not that much more recently, I mean, not up till today, but maybe when you get up to Homo erectus, which is being able to keep a beat would have been important for activities like group rhythmic activities and hand clapping and singing and dancing, and also for the reciprocal vocal musical interactions of mothers and infants. We see all of these happening, not giving priority to one or another, but eventually evolving out of those bipedal substrates, and that eventually those kinds of activities were exapted or became kindling, if you will, for the evolution of musical skills, as we might think of them today, and language. So we see music and language as co-evolving. And we tend to think, we really dichotomize them. You know, music's right hemisphere emotional, language is symbolic, left hemisphere, but we think it's a package and it evolved together, and I think I have a slide here. So we hypothesized that during the Botanic Age, bipedalism had direct effects on fetuses and infants that stimulated the emergence of a derived, meaning advanced ability to keep a beat. And further, that this ability was eventually selected upon during the coevolution of music and language. So that is the hypothesis we're putting out there, and it will be criticized. And we'll have fun trying to answer those. So back to the slide I showed you earlier, back to the Botanic Age. Deliberate botanic inventions, I think, by apes were the baskets in the trees. By early hominids, I think, were the baskets on the hips. And also by hominids, it could have been Botanic Age, it was starting to happen. I don't know at what point everybody was sleeping on the ground, but eventually, for all practical purposes, everyone was. So baskets on the ground. Baskets, baskets, baskets. And P.S., I think our beds are baskets derived from baskets on the ground. When I teach my course at Florida State, I ask my students, did you make your nest today? And the first time I ask, they're very puzzled. But by the end of the semester, I have them saying, yes, teacher. Okay, so these were deliberate botanical inventions baskets. But I have one more I'm going to mention, which I don't think was deliberate, but I think it was really important. And it actually was the first basket that got me going on this entire project. And this was 4.5 years ago. And I was in Australia at meetings in Brisbane on Southeast archaeology, and met an experimental archaeologist there named Glenn Marshall, and he was doing experiments, he and a group of other experimental archaeologists, building rafts from natural bamboo, and then going out and trying to sail them, like to Australia. Really, really fun stuff, and with some success. And I asked him, because I'd been worrying about how did this little creature called Homo floresiensis, aka hobbit, which you've probably heard of, which was announced a long time ago now, 2004, I think, as being found on this island of Flores in Indonesia, and it alarmed paleoanthropologists because it was just too weird. It didn't look like it should be in that part of the world, and certainly not as recently. It lived there. We have remains that are 60 to 100,000 years ago. That's nothing. But there are tools. There's a jaw at 750,000 that looks like Hobbit. And then before 1 million years, you've got tools on this island. So somebody was there, and it's not a bad bet that somebody were the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. And my hypothesis, because it's the only one I could come up with, about how those initial colonizers got there was, I think it was accidental. It's really hard to get to Flores because of the weather and the deep sea and the sea currents. So I think that hominids were, and for other reasons I think this, were sleeping in trees for a long, long time. And the way that works, you can go to any of the great apes, is, but let's go to chimps because we're closest to them, is they bed down at night, maybe in their own tree, but there'll be someone in the next tree. Maybe 2 chimps will be in different parts of the tree. But a community, when it meets up in late afternoon, makes its tree nests in neighboring trees. There's wicked weather in Indonesia, cyclones and tsunamis, and they're fairly regular. And when these happen, trees, particularly if they're on the coast, often palm trees, get blown out to sea. So I suspect that this is how the first colonizers of Flores got there. You need to have enough of them to actually form a viable population. It's been modeled and estimated you need 20 individuals to get there. And this is the only way that I can think of that they would have. So baskets in the trees, on the hip, on the ground, and by accident, serendipitous, in the seas. So I've thought a lot about cognitive evolution in language and music, and these are widely considered topics in paleoanthropology. And in thinking about the Botanic Age and botanic inventions, they're something that I haven't given a whole lot of consideration to, but I think it's important, which is to do with this other side of our nature that we don't discuss a whole lot, those who do brain evolution, which is more the artistic, some might say spiritual side. And if you look today at contemporary cultures around the world, we can see there's a consciousness of wood and basketry in thinking about origins in all kinds of religion. You can think of whatever religions you may have learned about growing up. You'll find baskets, you'll find arcs, you'll find the importance of trees. And that's pretty worldwide, but also looking at artists. And so these are just a couple of three contemporary artists here. They're the son and father, who on the left weave these wonderful structures out of wood, and it's really big. And this is called Grand Central, and they do it deliberately, knowing it's going to disintegrate and be gone. And that's part of the whole artistic thing. Back to nature. You have in the middle a really huge, this is a very big sculpture. This one happens to be in Colorado, and it's by a Danish artist, Thomas Dombo, and it's called Isaac Heartstone. And again, he has this idea of the connection with botanical material, and he puts them in places where people need to hike into nature to see these. And then one of my favorites, on the right, you have Luis Garcia, who is in Santa Fe, or he's in New Mexico, and he's a Pueblo fiber artist. And he weaves, he makes the materials out of plant matter, makes the materials that are then woven. And for him, it's a very meditative, spiritual thing. He says he's communing with his ancestors, and he's also weaving good thoughts into whatever he's making for whoever will eventually own it. So wood, still today, is still with us at various levels, including this other kind of artistic side that we don't talk about that much. When we talk about cognition, I focused heavily on language for years and years and years because I do think it was the thing that kicked off reorganization of the brain neurologically, and the networks that were then picked up on by evolution and used or entailed in other kinds of advanced cognition. Music I've mentioned, but mathematics. So I think language was super, super important, really the most important thing. But I think now we need to go back to the very, very beginning and look at bipedalism. And I now believe, we've all thought bipedalism is really important for the origins of hominids. Now I think so more than ever, because I think I believe, actually, the story about keeping a beat and entrainment and pregnant hominid women. Okay, that's it for my formal remarks. I don't know how long I've gone, but let me thank the Leakey Foundation. It's an honor to give a talk here, and thank you for coming. I don't know why more of you didn't want to sit down here. Maybe because of this, do you think they need a bigger screen? Maybe you need to be back there to see the screen. And these other institutions and people, it's been a pleasure, so thank you very much.